Good evening. You're watching SMNI. This is Business and Politics. I'm your host, Dante Klink. Our topic tonight is fiscal policy, which is basically how the government spends the people's money. For that, our guest is Secretary Amenah Pangandaman of the Department of Budget and Management. Despite the Build program of the previous administration and the commitment of the 8-month-old Marcos government to continue that ambitious infrastructure development program, public spending contributes modestly to the gross domestic product, or GDP. Many of you have likely heard that the Philippine economy is consumption-led, with private spending accounting for 70% of GDP. Of course, ramping up government spending to spur faster growth is not without challenges. Not only should government spend correctly and wisely, it should also protect the people's money from corruption and inefficiencies. Secretary Pangandaman is very competent to discuss tonight's topic. Before being named DBM Secretary, she served government in various capacities for about 2 decades. Prior to her current post, she was DBM Undersecretary during the Duterte administration, and she was with the Central Bank before getting the call from President Marcos. We have many questions for our guest. We will begin with, how can government spending contribute to stronger and sustainable economic growth in the Philippines? Secretary Pangandaman, thank you for making time for Business and Politics. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, Secretary, in the past, the governments said that, the private sector is the engine of growth. But we are in sort of an unusual situation coming from the pandemic. And I think there was some expectations that government will take up some of that role for growth because the private sector is still trying to recover. Could you maybe share with us what is the general direction, or what are the general policies of the Marcos government in terms of public spending, and how can it contribute to a high growth trajectory?
I'm sure you're familiar with this. During the start of the administration, we presented the medium-term fiscal framework.
Yes.
And the medium-term fiscal framework was adopted by the Senate of the Philippines and the lower house. So by this time, we already have, when we started crafting the budget, we already have some sort of a structure of how are we going to craft our budget. Mm-hmm. So embedded in that medium-term fiscal framework is our 8-point socio-economic agenda.
Right.
So we tried to at least, even the short period, because we came in July,
right,
and then we have a constitution mandate that we have to pass it by the opening of Congress.
Right.
We tried to at least adhere to the medium-term fiscal framework and the 8-point socio-economic agenda.
Right.
The 5.268 trillion budget that the President just signed is consistent with that 8-point social
So it includes all of the 8 points,
yes,
even though you only had 6 months.
Yes, we tried to at least, we gave time during the cabinet meeting when we presented it. We gave time to our cabinet secretaries to at least read again the proposal, the budget, and at least put in there the the objectives of the MTFF and the projects and priority projects and programs of our president. So there, basically the budget that we presented to Congress and as passed and assigned as a president is consistent with that. What do I mean by consistent with that? Our spending to GDP will be more than 20% of our GDP. That will be consistent from 2022 to 2028. And then our fiscal deficit will go down from 7%, of course, coming from a pandemic, some sort of a recession, down to 3% by the end of the term of our Marcos Jr. administration. And then our infrastructure spending will continue to be 5.5 to 6% of GDP. And much of the budget that was already signed now, 40% of it, social services were cornered at. What is the social services? It is our funding or investment for our human capital development. These are for projects under the Department of Education. Of course, it's always the highest for our constitution. And then investment for our health sector and investment for social protection. Of course, as we continue to give our cash transfers to those who are displaced. And what else? Yeah, that's it for human capital development, labor, employment, and housing needs of our countrymen.
Yeah.
And then second is the economic sector. Of course, that's when the infrastructure development comes in, for our road networks, for our transportation, for mobility, and I think, and environment, natural resources. Of course, we want to take note of that because of the climate change. Yeah. That's basically, that's our priority.
Yeah. Second, just devil's advocate, right? The budget this year is about 4.9% higher than 2022. Now, some say that, it's not even at the same growth pace as inflation. I mean, it was at 5-something%. And yet the budget was billed as a recovery. But I think I've heard you say before that you're not happy with it, but there are realities that we have to contend with, right? But are you confident that the amount of public spending that will happen, now given the fact you only had 6 months of inputs really to give to it, is that enough really to help us attain that 6%, 7% target for the year? Or is it really the private sector that will rely on? I mean, how much role will the government play in that dynamic?
Yes, our budget increase for 2023 is, I think, the smallest in the last 10 years. Of course, given the situation coming back from the pandemic, our economy was relatively close compared to other countries. And but then this is what I always say, even if we have a small budget, we always tell our secretaries, our colleagues from the national government, what's important is to use it. Utilize the money, because otherwise, if you don't utilize it, it's just there. The money just sits there. So I think the marching order is for them to really. One feature of the budget is that when I submitted it to the Congress last July or August, last August, is that there's an early procurement system. So all the projects there that can be really implemented already can already be procured. So what happened is that upon checking the data, parang more than 30% of the budget has been awarded as early as January. So that's important because as early as January, early part of the year, especially for the infrastructure sector, because we have the dry season. We don't want the wet season to come in, and because it will be hard to construct. So I think what's important is that we are able to use the money efficiently and effectively.
Well, I saw some of the budget deliberations last year, and please correct me if I'm wrong. My general impression was that there was some hesitancy to allocate money for capital outlay, for instance. And yet we know for example, from VP Sara's report, there's a lot of classrooms that need to be built. COMELEC is trying to build an office. So many other agencies want to have their own, permanent building, and is that a problem, you think, that because it seems to be the allocation seems to be more for OPEX, what we call OPEX, maybe MOE for government, right? Rather than for investing in capital outlay and other important things.
When you talk about infrastructure, there's this big ticket items, big ticket infrastructure projects, and there are also social infrastructure. What is social infrastructure? I think this budget was able to fund most of the social infrastructure budget. These are the school buildings and health facilities, farm to market roads. That's why we need the help of private sector. You've been mentioning about the private sector. So I think during the early part of the administration, Secretary Jokno, the head of the economic team, revised or amended the BOT law, the IRR. So I think by that mere amendment, the private sector will be able to come in and help us with the big ticket projects. These are projects that are quite high in terms of investments, but there are returns if they want to invest on it.
Right. So the private sector, I'm just coming from that old soundbite we've heard that, it is the engine of, growth, right? I'm just thinking about how much government will take up that role, because in the past, the GDP component of public spending is quite small. I've seen figures, some 10%. But I think in 2021, it went up a bit to 20-something%. I'm not sure where it is now.
Now it's
with this budget.
Public spending is it will be consistent from 20 up to 21% by end of the term of the administration.
So it's quite high.
It's quite high. It's quite high. But also taking into consideration the help from the private sector, of course, the PPP,
right.
The PPP mode of acquiring projects. Yeah, and then I think what's also important is that during the past administration, we passed a couple of laws that will help them enter into our economy.
Right.
So,
all right. We'll be right back with Secretary Pangandaman. This is Business and Politics. Please stay tuned.